On October 17th, 1173, 400 royal knights stared across a muddy Suffolk field at 4,000 rebel soldiers and Flemish mercenaries who'd come to overthrow a king. By sunset, the Earl of Leicester was in chains, his Countess captured in full armor, and 10,000 silver marks worth of mercenary muscle lay dead in the marsh. This was England's most brutal one-afternoon slaughter of the 12th century. Think about those numbers. 400 against 4,000, a 10.1 disadvantage. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how loyalty and speed annihilated rebellion and gold. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval civil wars. First, the forced march that covered 40 miles in under 30 hours to trap an army before it could escape. Second, why a countess rode into battle in chainmail alongside her husband. And third, the swamp that turned England's most expensive mercenary force into drowning, armored corpses. But here's what makes this genuinely insane. How did Henry II's commanders even know the rebels had landed when communication moved at horseback speed? What split-second decision by the Earl of Leicester transformed certain victory into total catastrophe? Why did Flemish soldiers, famous across Europe for their discipline, break and run into a death trap? And how did 2 aging royal officials crush the best-funded rebellion of the Middle Ages in under 4 hours? To understand how 400 men destroyed a king's nightmare, we need to go back 3 months to when Henry II's own sons declared war on their father. In June 1173, Henry II of England received the kind of news that shatters empires from within. His own sons, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, had publicly renounced their allegiance and fled to the court of Louis VII of France. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was coordinated political warfare orchestrated by Henry's estranged wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and backed by the King of France himself. Within weeks, the most powerful monarch in Western Europe faced enemies on every border. Scotland invaded from the north. Flanders prepared an army for hire. And across the Channel, the greatest barons of England began sharpening their swords and counting their gold, calculating whether this was finally the moment to break free from Henry's iron grip. Think about the scale of this betrayal for a second. Henry II controlled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the Angevin Empire, the most powerful political entity in Western Europe since Charlemagne. He ruled England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and held overlordship of Brittany and parts of Wales and Ireland. He commanded tax revenues that dwarfed those of the French king. He had crushed every rebellion, every baronial uprising, every external threat for nearly 2 decades. And now his own blood, his own heirs, stood at the head of a coalition designed to tear that empire into pieces. Here's what makes this rebellion genuinely terrifying from Henry's perspective. It was simultaneous and coordinated across multiple fronts. In Scotland, King William the Lion crossed the border with thousands of troops, raiding and burning his way through Northumbria. In Brittany, local lords rose up against Henry's authority. In Aquitaine, Eleanor herself, one of the most politically sophisticated women of the Middle Ages, was actively recruiting rebel barons to her son's cause. And in France, Louis VII was writing blank checks, promising land, titles, and military support to anyone willing to stab Henry in the back. But here's where it gets insane. The coordination required for this rebellion reveals Eleanor's strategic genius. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. This was a planned military operation launched across 1,000 miles of territory, timed to overwhelm Henry's ability to respond. Medieval communication moved at horseback speed, roughly 30 to 50 miles per day, for urgent messages. That meant Henry, based in Normandy, was receiving crisis reports from Scotland, England, Brittany, and Aquitaine, with a week's delay or more. By the time he learned about one uprising and mobilized forces to respond, another front would explode into violence. Eleanor had weaponized the slowness of medieval information networks. The numbers defied belief. Within weeks of the rebellion's outbreak, Henry faced potential enemies numbering in the tens of thousands. Louis VII could field perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 French troops. The Scottish invasion force numbered at least 3,000. The Flemish mercenaries being hired by rebel barons represented another 4,000 to 5,000 professional soldiers. And across Henry's own territories, perhaps a third of his barons, men who owed him feudal loyalty, were either openly rebelling or waiting to see which side would win before committing. Henry's own intelligence network estimated he faced upwards of 20,000 potential hostile combatants, and his empire was burning on every border simultaneously. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. Henry's sons weren't just military threats. They were legitimate claimants to his throne. Henry the young king had already been crowned as co-king of England in 1170. An unprecedented move Henry had made to ensure succession stability. Now that decision had backfired catastrophically. Rebel barons could claim they weren't traitors. They were simply supporting the crowned king against his tyrannical father. It was political genius wrapped in military catastrophe. By July 1173, less than a month after the rebellion began, Henry's situation looked hopeless. He was trapped in Normandy, fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts with insufficient forces. England, the source of his wealth and the foundation of his empire, was vulnerable, defended only by a skeleton garrison and aging administrators. And across the Channel, the richest barons in England were counting their silver and preparing to buy an army that would finish what Henry's sons had started. One of those barons was about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. Robert de Beaumont, 3rd Earl of Leicester, was not a reckless man. He was one of the richest nobles in England, holding vast estates in both England and Normandy. A man whose grandfather had stood beside William the Conqueror at Hastings. But in the summer of 1173, he made a calculated gamble that would cost him everything. He looked at the map of Henry's crumbling empire and saw opportunity. With the king trapped in Normandy fighting his own sons, with Scotland ablaze, with half the English baronage wavering, Leicester decided this was the moment. He would invade England with an army of professional killers, link up with the rebel barons, and crown young Henry king. But assembling that army required something Leicester had in abundance: silver. He was about to spend 10,000 marks, enough money to feed a city for a year, on the deadliest mercenaries Europe had to offer. Let that number sink in for a moment. 10,000 marks in 1173 was an absolutely staggering sum. To put it in perspective, a knight's annual income might be 20 to 30 marks. A baron's castle could be built for 400 to 500 marks. The entire annual revenue of the English crown, the richest kingdom in Europe, was roughly 22,000 marks. Leicester was spending nearly half the king's annual income on a single military operation. This wasn't just a rebellion. This was a venture capitalist's bet on regime change, funded with enough silver to buy a small kingdom. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Leicester's calculation. He wasn't acting alone or impulsively. He was coordinating with a network of rebel barons across England, particularly Hugh Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk. Bigod controlled the powerful fortress of Framlingham in eastern England, and he'd promised Leicester that if the Earl could land with a professional army, Bigod would open his castle and provide a secure base of operations. Together, they commanded enough military force and territorial control to potentially hold East Anglia against any royal counterattack. The plan was elegant. Leicester provides the shock troops. Bigod provides the fortress and local support, and together they march on London while Henry is trapped across the Channel. But Leicester's strategy relied on speed and surprise. He knew that Henry's government in England was stretched thin, defended primarily by aging administrators and skeleton garrisons. If Leicester could land his mercenaries, march inland, and link up with Bigod before the royal forces could mobilize, he'd create a rebel stronghold that would be almost impossible to dislodge. Medieval sieges could last months or even years. Once inside Framlingham's walls with 4,000 professional soldiers, Leicester could wait out the winter, recruit more rebels to his cause, and potentially force Henry to negotiate a settlement that would partition the kingdom. The Earl spent July and August, 1173 in Flanders, personally overseeing the recruitment of his army. He wasn't hiring desperate bandits or untrained peasants. He was buying the 12th century equivalent of special forces, Flemish mercenaries with decades of combined combat experience. Chronicles suggest he assembled somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 infantry, along with hundreds of crossbowmen and support troops. These men came equipped with the latest military technology. Hardened leather armor reinforced with metal strips, long pikes, Danish axes, and the feared crossbow, which could punch through chainmail at 100 yards. For comparison, the entire Norman invasion force that conquered England at Hastings numbered around 7,000 to 8,000 men. Leicester was assembling an invasion army half that size, and unlike William the Conqueror, he wouldn't need to fight a single massive battle. He just needed to reach Framlingham. Here's where Leicester's confidence becomes arrogance. He assumed that Henry's government would need weeks to respond to his invasion, giving him ample time to march the 40 miles from his landing point to Bigod's fortress. He calculated that the royal commanders, de Lucy and de Bohun, were bureaucrats who would prioritize caution over aggression. He believed his Flemish mercenaries were superior to any force the English could scrape together on short notice. Every assumption was logical. Every assumption was based on experience and intelligence. And every single assumption was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. By mid-September, Leicester's army was ready. The ships were hired, the supplies loaded, the mercenaries assembled at the Flemish ports. The Earl looked across the Channel toward England and saw a kingdom ripe for conquest, defended by old men and depleted garrisons. He was about to learn that old men could be more dangerous than young warriors, and that sometimes the greatest military asset isn't numbers or equipment. It's the willingness to move faster than your enemy thinks possible. The fleet set sail on September 29th, 1173, heading for the Suffolk coast. In Leicester's mind, he was about to become the kingmaker who would reshape England's future. In reality, he was sailing toward the greatest disaster of his life, and he had less than 3 weeks to live as a free man. The mercenaries Leicester hired weren't desperate bandits or untrained peasants. They were Flemings, professional soldiers from the Low Countries who turned warfare into an industry. These men fought for whoever paid best, and Leicester paid spectacularly. His 10,000 marks bought him somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 veteran infantry, men who'd fought in countless European wars, equipped with the latest weapons and armor. Flemish mercenaries had a reputation that preceded them like smoke before a fire. They were disciplined, brutal, and utterly without the chivalric restraint that sometimes hampered noble knights. They would burn villages, slaughter garrison soldiers, and terrorize populations without hesitation. For Leicester, they represented a force multiplier that could tip the balance of the entire civil war. For Henry's loyalists, they represented an existential nightmare. A foreign army of professionals marching on English soil, and they were crossing the Channel in September 1173. Here's what made Flemish mercenaries different from regular feudal levies. They were full-time soldiers. While English knights might train for war and then return to managing their estates, Flemings lived in permanent military camps, drilling constantly, perfecting formations and tactics. They came from the urbanized, economically advanced Low Countries, where textile wealth had created a military-industrial complex decades ahead of the rest of Europe. These weren't farmers handed spears and told to fight. These were men who'd been soldiers since their teens, many of them veterans of the brutal conflicts between the Holy Roman Empire and various Italian city-states, wars where quarter was rarely given and casualties ran into the thousands. The equipment they carried reflected their professionalism. Each Fleming wore a gambeson, a quilted jacket stuffed with wool or cotton that could stop arrows and cushion sword blows, covered by hardened leather armor reinforced with metal plates at vital points. Many wore chainmail hauberks, not the full knightly suits, but enough to protect torso and arms. They carried Danish axes, weapons with 4-foot hafts and curved blades that could hook shields, trip horses, or split helmets. Their pikes were 12 feet long, creating a forest of steel points that cavalry couldn't penetrate. And critically, many were equipped with crossbows, weapons the Pope had tried to ban as too cruel for Christian warfare. Think about the crossbow's advantage for a second. An English longbow required years of training to use effectively. You needed to develop the specific back and shoulder muscles through constant practice from childhood. A crossbow could be learned in weeks and fired with devastating accuracy by anyone with basic training. It could punch through chainmail at 100 yards and had a flat enough trajectory to hit moving targets reliably. A force of 500 to 600 crossbowmen, which Leicester's army certainly included, could lay down a storm of bolts that would shred cavalry charges and pin down defensive positions. This was medieval firepower at its most lethal. But here's where the Flemish reputation for brutality becomes strategically important. Medieval warfare operated on an informal code. Garrisons that surrendered quickly might be spared, civilians who didn't resist would generally be left alive, and noble prisoners were valuable for ransom. Flemish mercenaries ignored all of these conventions. They were paid to win, not to be sporting about it. Chronicles from across Europe record their tactics: burning crops to starve out resistance, executing surrendered garrisons to terrorize the next town into immediate submission, taking no prisoners except those worth ransom money. This wasn't sadism. It was calculated terrorism designed to make future battles unnecessary. When a Flemish army approached, towns surrendered without fighting because resistance meant annihilation. The numbers defied England's defensive capacity. Leicester's force of 3,000 to 4,000 Flemings represented more professional infantry than existed in all of England's royal garrisons combined. Henry's military system relied on feudal knights, heavy cavalry who owed military service in exchange for land. Infantry were usually poorly trained local levies, men pulled from their farms for a few weeks of service. The idea of facing thousands of full-time professional soldiers who fought in coordinated formations was genuinely terrifying to English military planners. This wasn't a raid or a minor uprising. This was an invasion by Europe's premier military contractors, and they were coming to England specifically because they'd been told the kingdom was poorly defended and ripe for conquest. Leicester's fleet made landfall at Walton on the Suffolk coast on October 13th, 1173. The disembarkation took 2 full days. 4,000 men, their equipment, supplies, and siege weapons don't unload quickly from medieval transport ships. The Flemings set up a fortified beach camp, established perimeter guards, and began the process of organizing for the march inland. They moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times before in dozens of different countries. Scouts were sent ahead to map the route to Framlingham. Supply wagons were loaded and organized. The army formed into its marching columns. Leicester stood on the beach, watching his investment take shape before him. The silver had bought him the finest mercenary army that could be assembled in 1173. In 4 days, they would link up with Hugh Bygod's rebel forces at Framlingham. In 2 weeks, they would march on London. In a month, England would have a new king. What Leicester didn't know was that his landing had been observed, reported, and relayed to London within hours. And 2 old men who understood that speed mattered more than numbers were already riding north with every knight they could gather, racing to intercept the most dangerous army England had seen since the Norman conquest. While Henry II battled his sons in France, England was defended by a government held together with spit and willpower. The Chief Justiciar, Richard de Lucy, was in his 60s, ancient by medieval standards. His co-commander, Humphrey de Bohun, was similarly aged. These were not dashing young warriors. They were administrators, lawyers, the unglamorous backbone of royal bureaucracy. But they were also survivors of decades of civil war, men who'd seen the anarchy of Stephen's reign and understood what rebellion meant. Burned villages, murdered families, a kingdom torn apart. When word reached them in late September that Leicester had landed with his mercenary horde, de Lucy and de Bohun faced an impossible mathematics problem. The Earl's force was somewhere around 4,000 strong. The royal army they could scrape together, depleted by the king's campaigns in France, numbered perhaps 400 to 500 knights and their retinues. On paper, they should have retreated, dug in, and waited for reinforcements. But there was no time. Leicester was marching inland, trying to link up with Hugh Bygod, the rebel Earl of Norfolk, who commanded another substantial force. If those 2 armies united, England would have an insurmountable rebel coalition. De Lucy made the decision that would define his legacy. They would intercept Leicester immediately, regardless of the odds. Richard de Lucy wasn't just old. He was a relic of England's darkest era. He'd served since the 1130s, through the catastrophic civil war between Stephen and Matilda that had turned England into what chroniclers called a land where Christ and his saints slept. He'd watched the kingdom tear itself apart for 19 years, seen castles multiply from 50 to over 1,000, as every baron with ambition built his own fortress and became a warlord. He'd seen famine, he'd seen torture, he'd seen entire regions depopulated by roving bands of mercenaries who owed loyalty to no one. When Henry II finally brought order in 1154, de Lucy had been there, helping build the administrative machinery that transformed England from an anarchic patchwork into a functioning state. He knew exactly what was at stake if Leicester succeeded. This wasn't just about who wore the crown. It was about whether England would slide back into the abyss. Humphrey de Bohun was cut from the same cloth. He was Constable of England, responsible for military organization and logistics. He'd spent decades managing Henry's campaigns, coordinating supply lines, organizing garrisons, doing the unglamorous work that kept armies functional. Both men understood something that younger, more martial commanders often missed. Wars aren't won by the bravest charge or the most dramatic duel. Wars are won by getting your forces to the right place at the right time, with enough supplies to fight. And wars are lost when you let the enemy dictate the tempo of operations. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the decision these 2 men faced on October 13th, 1173. They had perhaps 48 hours to act. Leicester's ships had landed at Walton on the Suffolk coast. Framlingham Castle, where Hugh Bygod was waiting, sat roughly 40 miles inland. A marching army could cover that distance in 2 to 3 days if they pushed hard. Once Leicester reached Framlingham, he'd be inside one of the most formidable fortresses in eastern England. with stone walls 40 feet high and 13 feet thick at the base. Dislodging a combined force of 6,000 to 7,000 rebels and mercenaries from that position would require a siege that could last months, possibly years. By that time, other rebel barons across England would declare for Leicester, and the kingdom would fracture into competing power centers exactly as it had during Stephen's reign. The numbers were genuinely terrifying. De Lucy and de Bohun commanded perhaps 400 mounted knights and men-at-arms, drawn from the depleted garrisons of London, Winchester, and the home counties. That was it. Henry had taken the bulk of England's military strength to Normandy. The royal treasury in London held enough silver to potentially hire more troops, but recruiting, assembling, and training mercenaries would take weeks. They didn't have weeks. They had days, possibly hours. Think about the calculation these two aging bureaucrats had to make. They were proposing to intercept a professional mercenary army that outnumbered them 10 to 1 with a force of feudal knights who'd never fought together as a unit. If they engaged and lost, England would be defenseless. Leicester would have a clear road to London. The treasury would fall. The rebellion would succeed. But if they didn't engage, Leicester would reach Framlingham, and the war would be lost anyway, through slow strangulation rather than quick defeat. De Lucy made the call on October 14th, less than 24 hours after Leicester's landing was confirmed. The decision was so audacious, it bordered on madness. They would force march north, covering 40 miles in approximately 30 hours, and intercept Leicester somewhere between Walton and Framlingham before he could reach the safety of Bigod's fortress. They would give up the defensive advantage of their fortified positions. They would abandon the possibility of reinforcement. They would stake the entire kingdom on a single roll of the dice, betting that speed and surprise could overcome impossible odds. Humphrey de Bohun, when told the plan, reportedly paused, then nodded once. "If we don't do this," he said, "England burns. If we do this and lose, England burns faster. But at least we'll die trying to save it rather than watching it fall." On the morning of October 15th, 1173, 400 royal knights rode out of London at a punishing pace, heading northeast toward Suffolk. They carried minimal supplies, pushing their horses to the edge of endurance. Behind them, England held its breath. Ahead of them, an army of professional killers marched confidently inland, completely unaware that two old men had just declared war on mathematics itself. What happened next reveals something historians often overlook about medieval warfare. Information moved faster than armies, and the side that controlled intelligence controlled the battlefield. Within hours of Leicester's landing at Walton on the Suffolk coast, messengers were riding hard for London. Henry II's government had spent years building a network of sheriffs, reeves, and local officials whose primary job was exactly this: reporting threats to royal authority. The system worked with terrifying efficiency. By the time Leicester's Flemish mercenaries were still unloading their supplies from ships, de Lucy already knew their numbers, their route, and their destination. He knew Leicester was racing to join forces with Hugh Bigod at Framlingham Castle. More critically, de Lucy understood the terrain. Between Leicester's landing point and Framlingham lay a series of small rivers, marshes, and narrow roads, choke points where a smaller, faster force could intercept a larger, slower one. Medieval warfare wasn't just about who had more swords. It was about who moved faster and knew the ground better. De Lucy was about to prove that bureaucrats could outthink warriors. Here's what made Henry's intelligence system revolutionary for its time. In most medieval kingdoms, information traveled through informal networks. Merchants, travelers, random messengers hired for specific tasks. Henry had systematized it. Every shire had a sheriff who reported directly to the justiciar. Every hundred had a bailiff. Every significant port had a royal customs official. These weren't just tax collectors. They were the eyes and ears of the crown, and they had standing orders to report any unusual military activity immediately. The moment Leicester's fleet was spotted off the Suffolk coast on October 13th, a local reeve dispatched riders in multiple directions, one to the sheriff at Ipswich, one to the nearby royal garrison, and one directly toward London on the main road. Think about the speed of this communication for a second. Medieval messengers on urgent business, changing horses at predetermined stations, could cover 50 to 60 miles in a single day on good roads. The distance from Walton to London was roughly 90 miles. That meant de Lucy received confirmed intelligence about Leicester's landing within 36 hours, while the Flemish army was still organizing its march. Compare that to Leicester's information. He had no idea the royal commanders even knew he'd landed, let alone that they were already mobilizing a response. In the information war, Leicester was fighting blind while de Lucy was reading his playbook. But here's where de Lucy's genius becomes apparent. He didn't just know Leicester had landed, he knew exactly where Leicester had to go. There was only one strategic destination that made sense: Framlingham Castle, 40 miles inland, where Hugh Bigod commanded another rebel force. And crucially, there were only two viable routes from Walton to Framlingham for an army of 4,000 men with baggage trains and supply wagons. The northern route ran through marshy ground, prone to flooding, dangerous terrain for heavy loads. The southern route followed higher ground, but passed through a series of river crossings and the village of Fornham, St. Genevieve, where the road narrowed between the River Lark's marshlands and rising hills. De Lucy spread maps across his table in London and studied the terrain with the intensity of a chess master. He'd governed England's eastern regions for years. He knew every road, every ford, every patch of boggy ground. He could see the battlefield in his mind before Leicester had even begun his march. The River Lark's marshes near Fornham were treacherous, soft ground that looked solid but could swallow a man in armor. The road through Fornham created a natural funnel where Leicester's army would be strung out in a long marching column rather than deployed for battle. And most importantly, there were sight lines from the low hills where a cavalry force could observe the enemy's approach without being seen. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about medieval military intelligence. Terrain knowledge was worth more than extra soldiers. De Lucy understood that catching Leicester in march formation, before the Flemings could deploy into their defensive pike squares, would negate the mercenaries' numerical advantage. A cavalry charge into unprepared infantry on a road was a completely different battle than cavalry attacking prepared formations on open ground. The terrain at Fornham would turn Leicester's professional army into a liability. Their heavy equipment and supply wagons would slow them down and limit their ability to maneuver. But de Lucy's intelligence network revealed something even more valuable. Leicester had no local guides. The Earl was from Normandy, and his estates in England were primarily in the Midlands, not East Anglia. His Flemish mercenaries had never set foot in England before. They were navigating by rough maps and general directions, heading toward Framlingham without understanding the dangers of the ground they were crossing. Leicester was marching through unfamiliar country, unaware that every step was being reported, every movement tracked. On October 14th, de Lucy received a second wave of intelligence that confirmed his analysis. Leicester's army had left Walton on the 13th and was indeed taking the southern route, moving slowly due to the size of their baggage train. They were averaging perhaps 12 to 15 miles per day. Professional army pace, but not rapid. De Lucy did the mathematics. If Leicester maintained that pace, He would reach the area around Fornham on October 17th, late morning or early afternoon. That gave the royal forces 3 days to cover 40 miles and position themselves for an ambush. The pieces were falling into place with the precision of a well-oiled machine. De Lucy knew where Leicester was. He knew where Leicester was going. He knew the route Leicester would take. He knew the terrain better than his enemy. And now he knew exactly when Leicester would arrive at the killing ground. Leicester, confident in his professional army and his alliance with Bigod, marched inland without scouts ranging more than a mile ahead, completely unaware that his every movement had been observed, reported, and analyzed by an intelligence network that was about to hand him to 400 royal knights like a gift wrapped in silver. The hunt was on, and the prey didn't even know he was being stalked. What de Lucy and de Bohun did next sounds impossible by medieval standards. They assembled every available knight, man-at-arms, and mounted soldier they could scrape together from the garrisons of London and the home counties, somewhere around 400 cavalry, and began a forced march north towards Suffolk. They covered roughly 40 miles in somewhere between 24 and 30 hours, an absolutely punishing pace for medieval cavalry. Think about what this meant physically. These weren't modern soldiers with energy bars and hydration packs. These were men in chainmail, riding war horses that needed rest, water, and fodder. They rode through the night, navigating by moonlight and local guides, driven by the knowledge that every hour's delay meant Leicester got closer to Framlingham in safety. The gamble was enormous. If Leicester's scouts spotted them early, the Earl could simply avoid battle and reach Bigod's fortress. If the royal horses arrived too exhausted to fight, they'd be slaughtered by fresh mercenaries. But de Lucy was betting on something he'd learned in decades of warfare. Surprise is worth 1,000 swords. Leicester didn't know they were coming. He thought the royal forces were days away, still mobilizing in London. He was about to learn the cost of underestimating old men in a hurry. Let that pace sink in for a moment. Medieval armies typically marched 10 to 15 miles per day. That was considered good progress. Forced marches, pushing troops to their physical limits, might reach 20 miles in a day before men and horses started collapsing from exhaustion. De Lucy's force was averaging nearly 30 miles per day, and they were doing it in full battle gear. Each knight wore 40 to 60 pounds of chainmail. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for combat, weren't built for endurance racing. These animals weighed 2,500 to 1,800 pounds and needed to be walked, watered, and rested every few hours, or they'd literally run themselves to death. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the logistics of this march. De Lucy couldn't just point his army north and gallop. He had to coordinate rest stops at predetermined locations where fresh water and fodder had been pre-positioned by his sheriffs. Every 10 to 12 miles, the column would halt for 30 minutes, just long enough to water the horses and let the men catch their breath, but not long enough for muscles to stiffen or for momentum to die. Local guides, recruited from villages along the route, rode with the vanguard to navigate the roads in darkness. The column moved in organized sections. Scouts ahead, main body in the center, supply wagons bringing up the rear, all coordinated with military precision that would have impressed a Roman legion. The night march from October 15th to October 16th was brutal. The temperature dropped. Autumn fog rolled in from the marshlands, reducing visibility to a few yards. Horses stumbled on uneven ground. Men dozed in their saddles, jerking awake as their mounts shifted beneath them. De Lucy and de Bohun rode at the front, both men in their 60s, refusing to slow the pace or show weakness. They understood the psychology of command. If the old men at the front could maintain this killing pace, the young knights behind them couldn't complain without shame. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Medieval war horses weren't just transportation, they were weapons. A destrier cost 30 to 100 marks, roughly equivalent to a year's income for a wealthy knight. These animals were trained from birth for the shock of cavalry combat, conditioned to charge into massed infantry without flinching, to bite and kick enemy soldiers. But that training came at a cost. They were high-strung, aggressive, and prone to injury when pushed too hard. DeLucy was essentially running a high-performance engine at maximum RPM for 30 straight hours, knowing that every horse that went lame was a soldier who couldn't fight. By the time they reached the approaches to Fornham on the evening of October 16th, an estimated 30 to 40 horses had gone lame or collapsed from exhaustion. Those knights were left behind at villages along the route, reducing the already outnumbered royal force by another 10%. Think about the physical state of the men who actually made it. They'd been in the saddle for over 24 hours with minimal rest. Their chainmail had chafed their shoulders raw, their legs cramped from gripping their horses. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and facing a battle the next morning against professional soldiers who'd been leisurely marching at normal pace, camping each night, eating hot meals. On paper, this was suicide. DeLucy was about to throw 350 to 370 exhausted cavalry against 4,000 fresh mercenaries. But DeLucy had one advantage that mattered more than rest or numbers. Leicester had no idea they were coming. On the evening of October 16th, as the royal forces camped in concealment behind the low hills near Fornham, Leicester's army was settling into their own camp just 6 miles away, cooking dinner, telling stories, completely confident they'd reach Framlingham by the next afternoon without incident. The Earl's scouts had failed spectacularly. They'd been ranging ahead looking for threats from Framlingham, not behind them from London. At dawn on October 17th, DeLucy's cavalry formed up in silence behind the morning fog. The horses were blown, the men were exhausted. But they'd accomplished something Leicester thought impossible. They'd moved an entire army 40 miles in 30 hours without being detected. The element of surprise was complete. Leicester's professional mercenary army was about to be ambushed by bureaucrats on horseback. And the shock of that initial contact would determine whether England survived as a unified kingdom or descended back into civil war. The hunt was over. The killing was about to begin. Riding alongside the Earl of Leicester was someone who shouldn't have been there by any standard of medieval convention. His wife, Petronilla de Jos Grandmesnil, Countess of Leicester. And she wasn't riding as a passive observer or symbol of noble authority. Multiple chroniclers report that Petronilla rode into battle wearing chainmail, possibly even carrying weapons. This was extraordinary. While medieval women occasionally defended castles during sieges, noble women almost never participated in open field battles. So why was she there? Some historians suggest it was a symbolic gesture. Her presence meant the Leicester family's total commitment to the rebellion, putting their bloodline itself on the line. Others argue she may have been genuinely military-minded, perhaps even commanding part of the force. What we know for certain is that her presence was noticed and recorded, and when the battle ended, her capture would be almost as significant as the Earl's. She represents one of the strangest footnotes in medieval military history. A countess who quite literally rode to war beside her husband and paid the price for treason in chains. Here's what makes Petronilla's presence genuinely insane. In over 400 years of medieval English warfare, you can count on one hand the number of noblewomen who personally rode to open-field battles. Eleanor of Aquitaine had accompanied crusading armies, but as a political figure and patron, not as a combatant. Matilda of Tuscany led armies in Italy in the 11th century, but she commanded from behind the lines. Petronilla wasn't just present. Multiple sources specifically note she wore armor, That detail matters. Chainmail wasn't ceremonial. A hauberk of mail weighed 25 to 35 pounds and was designed for one purpose: keeping you alive in close combat. The fact that chroniclers, who routinely ignored or minimized women's military roles, specifically mentioned her armor, means her participation was impossible to overlook. Think about what this meant in terms of medieval social hierarchy. Petronilla was one of the highest-ranking noblewomen in England, descended from one of the most powerful Norman families. Women of her status were expected to manage estates, bear heirs, and represent their family's honor through piety and patronage. They were decidedly not expected to ride to war. The church preached that women were inherently unsuited for violence, that their role in warfare was to pray for victory, not to swing swords. For Petronilla to violate these norms so publicly was a statement that transcended military tactics. It was a declaration that the Leicester family was betting everything, including its reputation and its women, on this rebellion's success. But here's where it gets strategically interesting. Petronilla's presence may have served a calculated purpose beyond symbolism. The Flemish mercenaries were foreigners fighting for pay in a land they didn't know, for a cause they didn't care about. Mercenaries were notoriously prone to desertion when battles turned against them. They'd been paid up front, and dead men can't spend silver. But seeing a noblewoman, the Countess herself, riding in armor alongside them sent a powerful message. If Leicester's own wife was willing to risk capture or death, then this wasn't just another contract. The family's honor, wealth, and future were on the line. It was a propaganda move designed to shame the mercenaries into fighting harder, to make them understand that retreat would mean abandoning not just an employer, but a woman who'd shown more courage than many knights. Some chronicles suggest Petronilla may have commanded the baggage train and supply elements, not frontline combat troops, but the essential logistics that kept an army functional. This would make tactical sense. Medieval armies were accompanied by hundreds of supply wagons, servants, and camp followers. Someone needed to manage that chaos, and a countess would have the authority to give orders that would be obeyed without question. If true, Petronilla was functioning as Leicester's quartermaster, a role that required military knowledge and organizational skill. The fact that she was captured wearing armor suggests she was close enough to the fighting to be overrun when the battle collapsed. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the psychological impact of her presence. The Earl of Leicester's household knights and retainers knew Petronilla personally. They'd served in her halls, eaten at her table, sworn oaths of loyalty to the Leicester family. Seeing their lady in chainmail, riding to war, must have been simultaneously inspiring and deeply unsettling. It meant the stakes were absolute. Victory would elevate the family to kingmakers. Defeat would mean not just their own deaths, but watching their countess captured, imprisoned, possibly executed for treason. There would be no half measures, no negotiated settlements. The Countess in armor was a walking declaration. We win everything, or we lose everything. On the morning of October 17th, as Leicester's army marched in its long column toward what they thought was safety at Framlingham, Petronilla rode somewhere in the formation, her chainmail glinting in the autumn sun. She was likely positioned near the baggage train in the army's center, surrounded by household guards and the supply wagons carrying Leicester's 10,000 marks worth of equipment and supplies. She had no idea that less than a mile away, hidden by the morning fog and rolling terrain, 400 royal knights were forming up for a charge. She had no idea that within hours, she would become one of the most famous prisoners of the Civil War, a symbol of rebellion crushed and noble arrogance punished. Medieval warfare had many conventions, many unwritten rules about how noblewomen should be treated, protected, kept far from danger. Petronilla de Grandmesnil had shattered every one of those conventions. And in a few hours, she would discover that when you break the rules of medieval warfare, you pay the same price as the men. Capture, chains, and years in a prison cell. Her name forever attached to one of the most catastrophic military disasters in English history. The Countess in chainmail had ridden to war. Now she was about to learn what war cost. The morning of October 17th dawned cold and misty over the fields near Fornham, St. Genevieve, a small village about 6 miles north of Bury St. Edmunds. Leicester's army was strung out along the road, moving in a loose marching column, confident they'd reach Framlingham by nightfall. They had no idea that less than a mile away, hidden by the morning fog and the rolling terrain, 400 royal knights were forming up for a charge. The Earl's scouts had failed catastrophically, whether through incompetence, exhaustion, or simply the speed of the royal approach. Leicester's vanguard had no warning. The first indication that something was wrong came when the mist suddenly filled with the sound of hundreds of hooves. And then the English knights burst through the fog like an iron thunderstorm. This was the moment when Leicester's expensive professional army revealed its fatal weakness. It was an invasion force, not a fighting formation. The Flemings were spread across the road, their heavy equipment still being hauled in carts, their soldiers not yet deployed for battle. They were about to be hit by a cavalry charge while they were in marching order, the absolute worst-case scenario in medieval warfare. The time was approximately 9 a.m. when the Royal Cavalry crested the low hill overlooking the road. De Lucy and de Bohun had positioned their force with tactical precision during the pre-dawn hours, using the rolling terrain to mask their presence. The fog that morning was a gift from the gods of war. It reduced visibility to perhaps 50 to 100 yards, just enough for the English knights to form their battle line without being spotted. But not so thick they couldn't see their target once the charge began. 400 mounted knights spread across a front roughly 200 yards wide, packed 3 to 4 ranks deep. This was shock cavalry in its purest, most devastating form. Here's what made Leicester's position catastrophically vulnerable. A medieval army on the march wasn't a cohesive fighting unit. It was a stretched-out snake of men, horses, and wagons that could extend for a mile or more. Leicester's 4,000 Flemings were spread along the road in loose formation, scouts and light cavalry at the front, main body of infantry in the center walking alongside supply wagons, rear guard bringing up the back. The column was perhaps a mile long, which meant that when the English hit the center, the vanguard would be too far ahead to help and the rear guard too far behind. Leicester's numerical advantage of 10-1 was about to become meaningless because only a fraction of his troops would be engaged in the first critical minutes. Think about the tactical mathematics for a second. In proper battle formation, Flemish infantry could form defensive squares with pikes pointed outward, creating a forest of steel that cavalry couldn't penetrate. Their crossbowmen could deploy in protected positions, laying down covering fire. Their officers could coordinate movements and reinforce weak points. But in marching column on a narrow road, they were targets, not soldiers. The road was perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide, enough for a wagon and some men walking alongside. There was no room to deploy laterally, no room to form squares, no room to do anything except die. De Lucy raises his hand. 400 knights tense in their saddles, lances lowered to the horizontal striking position. The horses sense the coming violence, muscles bunching, ears flat against their skulls. Then De Lucy's hand drops, and 400 tons of horseflesh and armored men explode forward down the slope. The sound hits the Flemish column before the cavalry does. It starts as a low rumble that vibrates through the ground, felt in the chest before it's heard. Then it crescendos into thunder, the drumming of 1,600 iron-shod hooves striking earth in a building gallop. Flemish soldiers on the road freeze, heads turning, trying to locate the source of the sound in the fog. Someone screams a warning. Officers shout contradictory orders. Men start running in random directions, some trying to form up, others diving for the ditches alongside the road. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. The English cavalry accelerates from trot to canter to full gallop in less than 200 yards of downhill slope. By the time they burst through the fog and slam into the Flemish column, they're moving at roughly 20 to 25 miles per hour. A war horse at full gallop weighs 1,500 pounds. A fully armored knight adds another 200 to 250 pounds. That's nearly a ton of mass moving at car crash speeds. The kinetic energy of a single mounted knight hitting a stationary man is equivalent to being struck by a modern automobile. Now multiply that by 400, all hitting simultaneously along a 200-yard front. The impact is geological. The front rank of Flemish soldiers, men who'd survived battles across Europe, veterans who'd seen everything, simply cease to exist as organized humans. Bodies are thrown 10 to 15 feet through the air. Bones shatter with sounds like breaking tree branches. The English lances, 12-foot shafts of ash tipped with steel, punch through leather armor and gambeson like they're cloth. Horses crash into the supply wagons, splintering wood and sending equipment flying. The Flemish formation doesn't break, it explodes. Leicester, riding near the center of his column with his household knights and Petronilla, watches his expensive professional army disintegrate in less than 60 seconds. He's screaming orders that nobody can hear over the chaos. His Flemish captains are trying to rally their men, but cavalry charges break more than bodies. They break the human mind's ability to process organized resistance. The primitive survival instinct takes over. Run or die. But here's what Leicester doesn't know yet, what he won't understand, until it's far too late. De Lucy hasn't just caught him in marching formation. He's caught him with his back to a death trap. The road the Flemings are marching on runs parallel to the River Lark's marshlands, less than 100 yards to their left. And when men in armor panic and run, they don't run toward the enemy. They run away, perpendicular to the threat. They run straight toward the swamp that's about to swallow 3,000 of them whole. To understand what happened in the next 30 seconds, you need to understand the physics of a medieval cavalry charge. A war horse and fully armored knight together weigh roughly 1,500 to 1,800 pounds. Charging at 20 miles per hour, they generate kinetic energy equivalent to a modern car hitting a pedestrian. Now multiply that by 400 horses, all hitting the front ranks of an unprepared infantry formation simultaneously. The impact wasn't just violent, it was geological. Men were thrown through the air, bones shattered, armor crumpled like tin. The Flemish front ranks simply ceased to exist as organized units. Bodies were trampled under iron-shod hooves. The sound was overwhelming. Screaming horses, screaming men, the crash of metal on metal, and the deep, bass thud of massed cavalry hitting massed infantry. This was shock combat in its purest form, and the Flemings, despite their reputation and experience, had no answer to it. They weren't cowards. They were simply caught in the worst tactical position possible, and the English knights exploited it with predatory efficiency. Let that impact sink in for a second. The front 100 yards of Leicester's column, roughly 300 to 400 men, took the full force of 400 charging destriers in the space of perhaps 5 seconds. That's the entire shock delivered before the human brain can even process what's happening. Medieval cavalry charges weren't prolonged melees like Hollywood depicts. They were single, catastrophic impacts that either broke the enemy formation instantly or stalled out if the infantry held firm. At Fornham, there was no holding firm. There were men in loose marching order being hit by a steel avalanche they never saw coming. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the immediate aftermath of that first impact. The English knights didn't stop. Destriers were trained to keep moving forward, to use their momentum to plow through enemy ranks like living battering rams. The horses bit, kicked, and trampled. Knights in the saddle swung swords and war hammers downward into the chaos below. The second and third ranks of English cavalry flowed through the gaps created by the first rank, spreading the destruction laterally along the road. Within 30 seconds, perhaps 50 to 60 Flemish soldiers were dead or dying, and another 200 were knocked down, disoriented, or fleeing. But here's where medieval combat psychology becomes critical. Panic is contagious. When men see their comrades being destroyed by an enemy, they can't effectively fight back against. When they watch friends disappear under hooves and hear the wet crunch of bones breaking, the instinct to hold the line evaporates. The Flemish soldiers further back in the column, who hadn't even been hit yet, saw the English cavalry tear through the front ranks and made a split-second calculation. We can't win this. Some tried to deploy their pikes, forming small defensive clusters. Others turned and ran immediately. The professional discipline Leicester had paid 10,000 marks for lasted approximately 90 seconds before it cracked. Think about what this meant from Leicester's perspective. He'd invested a fortune in these men specifically because they were supposed to be unbreakable professionals who'd faced cavalry charges dozens of times. Flemish infantry had a Europe-wide reputation for standing firm against mounted knights, for using their pikes and crossbows to create killing zones that cavalry couldn't penetrate. But all of that assumed they had time to deploy, to form their defensive squares, to establish fields of fire. Caught in marching column, spread across a narrow road with wagons blocking lateral movement, the Flemings' professional training became irrelevant. They were mechanics without tools, surgeons without instruments, experts rendered useless by circumstance. The English knights pressed their advantage with brutal efficiency. They'd broken the Flemish front, and now they began rolling up the column, attacking in sequence rather than all at once. Small groups of 20 to 30 knights would slam into clusters of Flemish soldiers, scatter them, then wheel around and hit the next group. This was coordinated violence, not berserker rage. De Lucy and de Bohun had drilled these men in exactly this tactic: how to maintain formation during a charge, how to reform after impact, how to exploit infantry in disorder. At 9:15 a.m., roughly 15 minutes after the first contact, the Flemish column had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. It had fragmented into dozens of isolated groups, some trying to form defensive positions, some attempting to counterattack, most simply running. The supply wagons were abandoned, their contents spilling across the road as draft horses bolted in terror. Leicester's household knights, the most heavily armored and experienced troops in his army, were attempting a fighting retreat, trying to protect the Earl and the Countess while the army disintegrated around them. But the real killing hadn't even started yet. What happened in the next 15 to 20 minutes would transform a military defeat into a legendary massacre. And the instrument of that massacre wasn't steel or courage or superior tactics. It was geography. The River Lark's marshlands lay less than 100 yards to the west of the road. Soft ground covered in autumn grass that looked deceptively solid. And 3,000 panicked Flemish soldiers, weighed down with armor and equipment, were about to run straight toward it, driven by English cavalry who knew exactly where they were hurting them. The marsh was about to become a graveyard, and there would be no escape from what happened next. For perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, the Flemish mercenaries tried to hold. These were professionals, after all, men who'd fought in dozens of battles across Europe. But medieval warfare had a tipping point, a psychological moment when organized resistance collapsed into panic. It happened at Fornham with devastating suddenness. The Earl of Leicester, desperately trying to rally his troops, found himself surrounded. His household knights were cut off from the main body of the army. And then, as if a dam had burst, the Flemish line simply disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. But they weren't running into open fields where they might escape. They were running directly toward the marshlands along the River Lark. This is where Leicester's ignorance of the terrain killed his army. The marshy ground around Fornham, soggy from autumn rains, was deceptively dangerous. What looked like solid ground could swallow a man in armor up to his waist. And that's exactly what happened. Hundreds of Flemish soldiers, weighted down with chainmail and equipment, charged into the marsh trying to escape the English cavalry. And the ground ate them alive. The moment of collapse came at approximately 9:30 a.m. A Flemish captain near the center of the column, watching his defensive square being systematically destroyed by English knights who dismounted to fight on foot with axes and swords, made a decision that sealed his army's fate. He turned and ran. Not toward reinforcements or a better defensive position, just away from the killing. His men saw him flee and followed. Within seconds, what had been a disciplined fighting withdrawal became a stampede. Think about the psychology of that moment. These were men who'd been promised steady pay, easy victory, and glory. Instead, they'd been ambushed by an enemy that shouldn't have been able to reach them, fighting in terrain they didn't understand, watching their expensive equipment and training rendered useless. The social contract between mercenary and employer, we fight if you give us a reasonable chance to win, had been violated. They were done. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the geography of the killing ground. The River Lark's floodplain near Fornham was roughly 200 to 300 yards wide, covered in marsh grass that looked like solid meadow, but concealed water-saturated peat just inches below the surface. October 1173 had been unusually wet. The ground was sodden, and the weight of a man in armor, 40 to 60 pounds of leather, mail, and equipment, was enough to break through the vegetation mat and sink into the mud beneath. A man without armor might wade through slowly, getting wet and exhausted, but surviving. A man in armor who tried to run across became trapped within 20 to 30 steps. The first Flemings to reach the marsh didn't realize the danger until it was too late. They charged off the road and into the grass, running at full speed to escape the English cavalry pursuing them. The ground gave way. Men pitched forward, thrown off balance as their feet plunged into mud up to their knees. They tried to pull themselves free and sank deeper. Behind them, hundreds more mercenaries were fleeing toward the same death trap, unable to see what was happening to the men ahead because of the tall grass and the chaos of the rout. By 9:45 a.m., the marsh had become a scene of almost incomprehensible horror. Men trapped in the mud up to their waists screamed for help that never came. Others, trying to help their comrades, got stuck themselves. The weight of their armor pulled them forward. If you fall face first into 6 inches of water while wearing 50 pounds of mail, you don't get back up. Chronicles report men drowning in water so shallow you could kneel in it without your head going under. Think about that for a second. Professional soldiers who'd survived battles across Europe, suffocating in a Suffolk swamp because their equipment became their coffin. The English knights, lighter armored and familiar with the terrain, knew exactly where the solid ground ended and the marsh began. They pursued the Flemings to the edge of the wetlands and then stopped, forming a line to cut down anyone who tried to turn back. De Lucy and de Bohun had turned the marsh into a weapon as deadly as any sword. The fleeing Flemings had three options: fight the English cavalry on solid ground and die on steel, surrender and face execution or ransom, or risk the marsh. Hundreds chose the marsh. The marsh killed them all. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Some Flemish soldiers, realizing the danger, tried to strip off their armor while standing in the mud. Chronicles describe men frantically cutting at leather straps and mail laces, trying to shed the weight that was pulling them under. But chainmail hauberks don't come off quickly. They're pull-on garments that require help to remove properly. Men died with their hauberks halfway over their heads, blind and drowning in mud and water they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. By 10 a.m., less than an hour after the first English charge, Leicester's invasion force had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors, desperately trying to organize any kind of defense. The Earl himself, surrounded by perhaps 50 to 100 household knights who'd remained loyal, was fighting a desperate last stand on a small hillock near the road. Petronilla, the Countess in chainmail, was somewhere in that shrinking circle of defenders. And all around them, the marsh was slowly filling with the dead and dying. Perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 Flemish soldiers already dead or trapped, with more fleeing into the wetlands every minute. The professional army Leicester had spent 10,000 marks to assemble was now drowning in English mud. And the battle was about to enter its final, most brutal phase, the systematic extermination of everything that remained. The River Lark's marshlands became a medieval killing floor, unlike anything England had seen in decades. Flemish soldiers, exhausted and terrified, waded into the wetlands thinking they could escape across to the other side. They were catastrophically wrong. Medieval armor, while not as heavy as popular myth suggests, is still 40 to 60 pounds of metal. In solid ground, a trained soldier can move effectively. In a swamp, that armor becomes an anchor. Men sank into the mud up to their knees, then their waists. Some toppled forward and couldn't get back up, their faces pressed into the marsh water, drowning in 6 inches of muddy water while their comrades stumbled past them. The English knights, lighter and more familiar with the terrain, picked them off methodically. This wasn't even combat anymore, it was extermination. Chronicles report that the marsh was so choked with bodies that you could supposedly walk across the dead without touching water. That's almost certainly an exaggeration, but it captures the horror. England's most expensive mercenary army was drowning in a Suffolk swamp, and there was nothing Leicester could do to stop it. Between 9:45 a.m. and 11 a.m. on October 17th, roughly 75 minutes, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Flemish soldiers died in or around the River Lark marshlands. Let that number sink in. That's 25 to 40 men dying every single minute for over an hour. The vast majority didn't die from sword wounds or lance strikes. They died from exhaustion, exposure, and drowning in a swamp that should have been completely survivable for unarmored men. This wasn't warfare. This was a mass industrial accident where the product being destroyed was human beings. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the mechanics of dying in a medieval marsh while wearing armor. When you sink into water-saturated peat up to your waist, you can't generate the leverage needed to pull yourself out. Your legs are stuck in thick mud that creates a suction effect. The deeper you sink, the harder it becomes to extract yourself. A chainmail hauberk weighs 25 to 35 pounds and pulls downward constantly. If you lose your balance and fall forward, the mail becomes a weight vest dragging your face into the water. Your arms are trapped trying to push yourself up, but they're sinking into the same soft mud. You inhale water. You panic. Your struggling only drives you deeper. Death comes in perhaps 60 to 90 seconds. Not from the water itself, which is shallow, but from your inability to keep your airways clear while wearing equipment designed for a completely different environment. The English knights understood this perfectly. They positioned themselves along the solid ground bordering the marsh and executed a tactic that was brutally efficient. They didn't chase the Flemings into the wetlands. They herded them. Small groups of 10 to 15 knights would charge at clusters of Flemish soldiers who'd tried to turn back from the marsh, driving them back toward the water. The message was clear. Your choice is steel or swamp. Most chose swamp. Most died. Think about what this looked like from Leicester's position. The Earl, fighting his desperate last stand with his household knights on the hillock near the road, could see the entire catastrophe unfolding. He watches his 10,000 mark investment, 4,000 professional soldiers who were supposed to make him kingmaker of England, scattered across a quarter-mile of marsh and road. He can hear the screams of men trapped in the mud. He can see the English cavalry methodically cutting down anyone who tries to escape. And he knows, with absolute certainty, that he's lost everything. His fortune is gone. His military force is being annihilated. His political future is over. And in a few minutes, he'll be either dead or a prisoner facing execution for treason. By 10:30 a.m., the marsh had become so choked with dead and dying men that it was actually impeding the escape of those still alive. Bodies floating in the shallow water created obstacles. Men trying to wade through had to climb over corpses, losing their footing and joining the dead. Some Flemish soldiers, trapped but still alive in the mud, were screaming for mercy, begging the English knights to pull them out and take them prisoner. Some were shown mercy. Most were left to drown or die of exposure over the next several hours as the cold October water sapped their body heat and their strength gave out. Here's where it gets genuinely insane from a casualty perspective. Modern historians estimate that of Leicester's original force of 3,000 to 4,000 Flemish mercenaries, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 died at Fornham. Of those deaths, perhaps only 300 to 500 were killed in direct combat with English weapons. The rest, 2,000 to 2,500 men, died in the marsh or during the rout. That's an 85 to 90% non-combat casualty rate, virtually unheard of in medieval warfare. Most medieval battles saw perhaps 10 to 20% of the losing side killed, with the rest captured or escaped. Fornham wasn't a battle. It was a geographical execution where the terrain did more killing than the soldiers. The English knights, watching this massacre unfold, felt no particular triumph. Many were sickened by what they were witnessing. Medieval warfare had conventions, expectations about how enemies should die. In combat, facing their killers with weapons in hand. Watching thousands of professional soldiers drown in mud like animals trapped in quicksand violated something fundamental about the warrior code. But de Lucy and de Bohun had calculated that England's survival was worth any amount of horror, and they didn't call off the pursuit. By 11 a.m., the killing in the marsh had mostly stopped, not because the English showed mercy, but because there was almost no one left alive to kill. The surface of the wetlands was studded with bodies, some floating, some half-submerged, some still upright but dead, held in place by the mud that had trapped them. The autumn grass was stained red-brown with diluted blood and churned earth. On the hillock, surrounded by perhaps 40 remaining household knights, the Earl of Leicester prepared for his final stand. He could see the English cavalry regrouping, forming up for one last charge to capture or kill what remained of his command. Beside him, Petronilla, still in her chainmail, waited for the end. The drowning grounds had claimed Leicester's army. Now the English knights were coming for Leicester himself, and there would be no escape into the marsh this time. Only capture, chains, and the long humiliation of treason's price. Robert de Beaumont fought like a man who understood his world was ending. Surrounded by English knights, his army disintegrating around him, he and his remaining household troops tried to cut their way out of the encirclement. Medieval chroniclers, who loved to record acts of chivalric valor even in defeat, noted Leicester's courage. But courage wasn't enough. One by one, his knights were pulled from their horses. The Earl himself, fighting desperately, was finally overwhelmed and dragged to the ground. He was stripped of his helmet, bound, and presented to the royal commanders. This was the moment that defined the rebellion's failure in England. Leicester wasn't just a rebel lord. He was one of the greatest magnates in the kingdom, a man whose lineage traced back to the conquest itself. His capture sent a message that would echo across every rebel castle in England. Henry's government could reach anyone, defeat anyone, and punish anyone. No amount of money, no number of mercenaries, and no foreign alliance could protect you from royal justice if you raised your sword against the king. At 11 a.m., the tactical situation was hopeless. Leicester stood on his hillock surrounded by perhaps 40 to 50 household knights. The core of his military retinue, men who'd served his family for decades, some of whom had ridden with his father. These weren't mercenaries who could be bought off or who'd flee when the odds turned bad. These were sworn vassals whose honor demanded they die beside their lord, if necessary. They formed a tight circle around Leicester and Petronilla, shields locked, weapons ready, knowing that surrender meant either execution or years in a dungeon, and that fighting meant almost certain death. They chose to fight. Think about the mathematics of their position. 40 knights against perhaps 200 to 250 English cavalry, who'd now regrouped after the slaughter in the marsh. The English had momentum, victory, and overwhelming numbers. Leicester's men had exhaustion, desperation, and the knowledge that their 4,000-man army had been reduced to this tiny circle of defenders in less than 2 hours. The hillock gave them some advantage. Cavalry charging uphill loses momentum and power. But it also meant there was nowhere to retreat, no possibility of breaking out and escaping. De Lucy and de Bohun, watching from their command position, made a calculated decision. They wanted Leicester alive. A dead rebel earl was a martyr. A captured rebel earl in chains was a propaganda victory worth more than any battlefield triumph. The order went out to the English knights. Take prisoners if possible, especially the Earl himself. But make no mistake, if Leicester's men resisted, they would be killed without mercy. The English cavalry charged the hillock at approximately 11:15 a.m. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Leicester's household knights met the charge with the kind of desperation that makes ordinary men dangerous. They fought with swords, axes, and maces, knowing this was their last battle. Chronicles describe Leicester himself in the thick of the fighting, his sword red to the hilt, his surcoat torn, screaming defiance at the English knights surrounding him. Here's what made this last stand genuinely remarkable. It lasted nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes of sustained close-quarters combat where 40 men held off a force 5 times their size. In medieval warfare, where battles could be decided in minutes, that's an eternity. One by one, Leicester's knights went down, pulled from their horses by multiple attackers, beaten into submission, or killed outright when they fought too fiercely to be taken alive. The hillock became a charnel house of wounded men, dead horses, and broken weapons. Here's where it gets genuinely insane from a tactical perspective. Leicester himself killed or wounded at least 3 English knights during the final melee. Chroniclers specifically mention his prowess because it was unusual for a high-ranking noble to be personally involved in such desperate hand-to-hand combat. Most earls commanded from behind the lines. Leicester was swinging a sword like a common soldier, fighting for his life with the ferocity of a man who understood that capture meant his entire bloodline would be destroyed, his estates confiscated, his name dragged through the mud as a traitor. At approximately 11:35 a.m., it ended. A group of English knights, fighting as a coordinated unit, managed to unhorse Leicester by killing his mount beneath him. The Earl crashed to the ground, pinned partially under his dead horse's weight. Before he could extract himself, 3 knights were on him, swords at his throat. Leicester, gasping for breath, bloodied and exhausted, had no choice. He yielded. The moment Leicester's helmet was removed and his identity confirmed, everything changed. English knights who'd been fighting with murderous intensity suddenly became concerned with protocol and prisoner handling. This wasn't just another captured enemy. This was the 3rd richest man in England, a peer of the realm, someone whose ransom value could fund a small war. He was immediately bound with leather straps, his weapons stripped away and placed under heavy guard. The fighting around him sputtered to a halt as the remaining Leicester household knights, seeing their lord captured, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the symbolic weight of this capture. Leicester's grandfather, Robert de Beaumont, had fought at Hastings in 1066 alongside William the Conqueror. The family had been at the apex of Norman aristocracy for over a century. They were kingmakers, power brokers, men who'd shaped England's destiny through 3 generations. And now, in a muddy Suffolk field, that entire legacy was shattered. Leicester, bound and on his knees before Richard de Lucy, a man he'd considered socially inferior, a mere administrator, represented the death of the old aristocratic order where birth and lineage guaranteed power. De Lucy, looking down at the captured earl, reportedly said nothing. He didn't gloat, he didn't mock. He simply had Leicester placed under guard and began organizing the systematic capture and imprisonment of the remaining rebels. The message was clear. This wasn't personal. This was the machinery of royal justice processing a traitor, regardless of his bloodline or his wealth. By noon, the battle was effectively over. Leicester's invasion force had ceased to exist. But one final capture remained, one that would shock England even more than the Earl's own imprisonment. Petronilla de Grandmesnil, the Countess in chainmail, was about to become medieval England's most famous female prisoner of war. When the battle finally ended and the English knights began sorting through prisoners, they made a discovery that shocked even veteran soldiers. Among the captured was the Countess of Leicester herself, still wearing armor. Petronilla de Grandmesnil had fought beside her husband and, like him, would now face the consequences of treason. Her capture was treated with a mixture of fascination and scandal by medieval chroniclers. Women of her rank simply didn't participate in battles, and her presence in armor was seen as either remarkably courageous or shockingly improper, depending on the chronicler's perspective. She would be imprisoned separately from her husband, held in reasonably comfortable conditions befitting her rank. But she would remain a prisoner for years. Her fate became propaganda for the royal cause. Even the wives of traitors couldn't escape Henry's justice. The image of a countess in chains, captured on an English battlefield, became one of the enduring symbols of the rebellion's failure. Petronilla was found at approximately 12:15 p.m., hiding among a group of wounded household knights near the base of the hillock. She'd removed her helmet but was still wearing her chainmail hauberk, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with dirt and possibly blood. The English knight who recognized her likely someone who'd seen her at court or knew the Leicester family's heraldry, reportedly stopped dead in his tracks, uncertain how to proceed. Taking a noblewoman prisoner on a battlefield was virtually unprecedented in 12th century England. There were protocols for capturing enemy lords, well-established procedures for ransom and imprisonment. But a countess in armor? That was genuinely uncharted territory. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the immediate reaction to her capture. The English knights were divided on how to treat her. Some argued she should be handled with the courtesy due her rank and sex, disarmed gently, provided with female attendants, treated as a lady who'd been unfortunate enough to be caught near a battle. Others argued she'd forfeited any claim to special treatment by participating in armed rebellion while wearing chainmail. She was a combatant, or at the very least, a military auxiliary, and should be treated like any other captured rebel. De Lucy, when informed of her capture, made a pragmatic decision. She would be treated with the courtesy appropriate to her rank, but she would absolutely be imprisoned as a traitor. There would be no pretending she'd been an innocent bystander. Think about the propaganda value of this capture for a second. Henry II's government had been fighting a rebellion framed partly as a struggle between loyal subjects and traitorous nobles who put their own ambition above the kingdom's welfare. Petronilla's capture in armor provided perfect visual proof of the rebels' desperation and moral bankruptcy. Here was a woman who should have been in a castle managing estates and praying for her husband's victory, instead riding to battle like some pagan warrior queen. Royal propagandists would spend years highlighting this detail, using it to paint the rebellion as so extreme, so radical, that it had even corrupted proper gender roles and Christian values. The reaction across England when news of her capture spread was electric. In the 12th century, noblewomen were seen as the moral guardians of their families, the civilizing influence that kept warrior husbands from degenerating into pure violence. Petronilla's presence on the battlefield violated every expectation about how aristocratic women should behave. Some viewed her as heroically loyal, a wife who loved her husband enough to risk death beside him. Most viewed her as scandalously unwomanly, proof that the Leicester family had lost any claim to moral authority or divine favor. Here's where it gets genuinely insane from a historical perspective. We can find only 3 or 4 other documented cases of high-ranking noblewomen being captured on medieval battlefields in full armor during the entire 12th and 13th centuries. This wasn't rare. It was virtually unprecedented. Petronilla had entered the record books, but not in the way the Leicester family would have wanted. She'd become famous not as a countess of one of England's premier families, but as the woman who wore armor to war and lost. Her imprisonment was carefully calibrated to maximize humiliation while maintaining aristocratic propriety. She was taken first to a secure manor house, then eventually to Winchester Castle, one of England's most prestigious royal fortresses. She wasn't thrown into a dungeon. Her cell was likely a comfortable room in the castle keep, with servants to attend her and decent food. But she was under constant guard, her movements restricted, her communications monitored. She could receive visitors only with royal permission. She could write letters only if they were read by her jailers first. She was, in every meaningful sense, a prisoner of the state. The ransom negotiations for Petronilla dragged on for years. Unlike her husband, whose eventual ransom was set at an astronomical sum, Petronilla's release was complicated by questions about whether women could even be held liable for treason. Medieval law was unclear. Was she guilty of her own crimes? Or was she simply following her husband's commands as a wife was obligated to do? Henry's government eventually decided it didn't matter. She'd been captured in armor on a battlefield fighting against the king. That was enough. She would remain imprisoned until the Leicester family paid for her release, whenever that might be. By the time Petronilla was finally released in 1177, 4 years after Fornham, she'd become a cautionary tale told across Europe. Young noblewomen were warned. This is what happens when you step outside your proper role. This is the price of following your husband into treason and war. The Countess who rode to battle in chainmail had become a symbol, but not the heroic symbol she and Leicester had intended. She'd become a warning. But while Petronilla sat in her comfortable prison cell, the true cost of Fornham was becoming clear across England. The rebellion's backbone had been broken in 4 hours on a Suffolk field, and the message was reverberating through every rebel stronghold in the kingdom. Resistance was futile, and the price of treason was total destruction. As the October sun set over Fornham, the scale of Leicester's defeat became clear. The Flemish mercenary force had been effectively annihilated. Chronicles give varying casualty figures, but most agree that several thousand mercenaries died, the vast majority in the marsh or during the rout. Some estimates put Flemish dead at 3,000 or more out of the original 4,000-strong force. A few hundred were captured and would later be ransomed or executed. Perhaps only a few dozen escaped to make it back to the coast and eventually to Flanders, carrying stories of the disaster. The royal casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light. Possibly fewer than 50 killed, though exact numbers are uncertain. This casualty ratio, roughly 60.1 or higher in favor of the royal forces, stands as one of the most lopsided victories in medieval English warfare. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic impact. Leicester had spent 10,000 marks, a fortune that could have funded multiple military campaigns and achieved precisely nothing. His army had lasted roughly 4 hours on English soil before being destroyed. The rebellion's entire strategy in England, which depended on Leicester's force linking up with other rebels and creating an unstoppable coalition, had collapsed in a single afternoon. The grim task of counting the dead began at approximately 2 p.m. on October 17th, while there was still daylight to work by. English soldiers, along with pressed villagers from Fornham and surrounding settlements, began the process of sorting through the carnage. The dead on the road and hillock were relatively easy to count. Perhaps 400 to 500 bodies, mostly Flemish mercenaries killed in direct combat. But the marsh was a different nightmare entirely. Bodies were scattered across a quarter-mile of wetlands, some floating, some submerged, some trapped upright in the mud. Recovery teams wading into the marsh reported finding corpses 50 to 100 yards from the solid ground, men who'd made it that far before exhaustion and their armor pulled them under. The actual body count in the marsh was never completed with precision. The numbers were simply too high and the conditions too difficult. Chronicles settled on several thousand as the best estimate anyone could provide. Think about those numbers in context. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which decided the fate of England, total casualties on both sides were estimated at $6,000 to $8,000 over an entire day of fighting. At Fornham, in 4 hours, one side alone lost 3,000 dead. The Battle of Lincoln in 1141, a major engagement of the Civil War between Stephen and Matilda, saw perhaps 500 to 800 total casualties. Fornham's death toll exceeded most major medieval English battles, and it all happened in a single morning in a backwater Suffolk village most people had never heard of. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the financial devastation this represented. Each Flemish mercenary had been paid roughly 2 to 3 marks up front, with promises of more upon victory and the opportunity for plunder. Leicester had also equipped many of them with weapons and armor, purchased new siege equipment that was now scattered across the battlefield, and paid for transport ships, supplies, and logistics. The total investment was somewhere around 12,000 to 14,000 marks when all costs were calculated, roughly equivalent to 60% of England's total annual royal revenue. And the return on that investment? Zero negative, actually, because Leicester's estates would now be confiscated, his wealth seized, and his family financially ruined for generations. This was medieval venture capital at its most catastrophic. The strategic calculations were even more devastating. Hugh Bigod, waiting at Framlingham Castle with his own rebel force, received news of Leicester's destruction by the evening of October 17th. Bigod had been counting on Leicester's professional mercenaries to provide the offensive striking power while Bigod supplied the fortress and local support. Without Leicester, Bigod had a castle and perhaps 500 to 800 local troops. Enough to defend, but nowhere near enough to challenge royal authority. Within days, Bigod would begin negotiating his surrender. Other rebel lords across England, who'd been waiting to see if Leicester succeeded before committing their own forces, immediately backed away from the rebellion. The collapse was total and instantaneous. Let that strategic impact sink in. The entire rebellion in England, which had been coordinated across multiple regions, involved dozens of noble families, and threatened to partition the kingdom, ended because of one 4-hour battle. Every rebel calculation had been based on Leicester's mercenary army, creating a protected zone in eastern England where the rebellion could consolidate and grow. Without that army, there was no safe haven, no offensive capability, and no hope of victory. De Lucy and de Bohun hadn't just won a battle, they decapitated the rebellion's entire strategic logic with surgical precision. The prisoners presented another problem: what to do with several hundred captured Flemish mercenaries and rebel knights. Medieval convention called for ransoming noble prisoners and sometimes releasing common soldiers after they swore oaths not to fight again. But these were foreign mercenaries who'd invaded England. They'd violated not just military protocol, but national sovereignty. De Lucy made a calculated decision. The mercenaries would be imprisoned indefinitely or executed as examples. The message was clear. Foreign soldiers who invade England die in English mud or rot in English dungeons. There would be no ransom market for traitors and invaders. By nightfall on October 17th, the battlefield had been largely cleared of living prisoners and valuable equipment. The dead would be buried in mass graves over the next several days. The marsh bodies were simply left where they fell, too difficult to recover and not worth the effort. Scavengers and local peasants would spend weeks stripping the corpses of anything valuable. Chainmail that could be repaired and sold, weapons, belt buckles, coins, boots. The marsh would give up bodies for months afterward as the water levels changed and mud shifted. The numbers told a story of unprecedented disaster. 3,000 dead, 400 captured, perhaps 50 escaped. A 10,000 mark investment turned into corpses and chains. A rebellion that should have reshaped England strangled in its cradle. And 2 old bureaucrats who'd gambled everything on speed and surprise had just saved a kingdom with 400 knights and perfect tactical execution. But the true consequences of Fornham were only beginning to ripple outward across England and Europe, carrying a message that would reshape the political calculus of the entire Civil War. The news of Fornham spread across England with the speed of salvation. Every wavering baron, every rebel, sympathizer, every lord who'd been calculating whether to join the uprising suddenly had their answer. Rebellion meant destruction. Richard de Lucy and Humphrey de Bohun had done more than win a battle. They'd prevented a civil war from metastasizing into a national catastrophe. Within days, rebel strongholds across England began negotiating surrender. Hugh Bigod, who'd been waiting at Framlingham to join Leicester, found himself isolated and chose submission over annihilation. The Earl of Leicester was paraded through England in chains as a living warning, eventually imprisoned at Falaise in Normandy. His vast estates were confiscated, his wealth stripped away, his political power destroyed. The Flemish disaster at Fornham had another, darker consequence. It poisoned the reputation of foreign mercenaries in England for decades. The memory of thousands of Flemings drowning in English marshes became a propaganda weapon, a story told to demonize foreign hirelings who dared set foot on English soil. The battle entered popular consciousness not just as a military victory, but as a national deliverance from foreign invasion. The first messenger reached Hugh Bigod at Framlingham Castle at approximately 4 p.m. on October 17th, less than 7 hours after the battle ended. Think about that timeline. Medieval communication was supposed to be slow, taking days for news to travel between regions. But this message, Leicester is destroyed, the mercenaries are dead, the Earl is captured, moved at emergency speed because everyone understood what was at stake. Bigod, standing in his great hall receiving the report, understood immediately that his entire strategic position had evaporated. He'd committed treason based on the calculation that Leicester's 4,000 mercenaries would provide military muscle that royal forces couldn't match. Now those mercenaries were corpses in a marsh. And Bigod was alone in his fortress, with perhaps 800 troops facing the wrath of a government that had just proven it could annihilate professional armies. Within 48 hours of Fornham, by October 19th, Bigod sent envoys to Delucy requesting terms for surrender. He wasn't negotiating from strength, he was begging for mercy. The speed of his capitulation reveals just how completely Fornham had shattered rebel morale. Bigod had been one of the rebellion's key leaders, a man who'd been planning this uprising for months. One 4-hour battle reduced him to a supplicant desperately trying to save his estates and his life. Delucy, demonstrating the same cold calculation that had won at Fornham, offered terms. Bigod would surrender Framlingham and his other castles, pay a substantial fine, and provide hostages to guarantee his future loyalty. The alternative was siege, starvation, and eventual execution. Bigod accepted immediately. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the cascade effect across England. Within 1 week of Fornham, at least 6 other rebel lords either surrendered outright or opened negotiations with royal authorities. Within 2 weeks, the number had risen to 12. The rebellion in England, which in early October had controlled or threatened perhaps a third of the kingdom's territory, had collapsed to isolated pockets by early November. The mathematics were brutal. Every day that passed after Fornham made rebellion look more suicidal and submission more attractive. No one wanted to be the next Earl paraded through England in chains. Leicester's humiliation was systematic and public. He was marched from Fornham to London, then displayed in various towns across England as a living propaganda exhibit. This is what happens to traitors. Chronicles describe crowds gathering to see the great Earl of Leicester, descendant of William the Conqueror's companions, reduced to a chained prisoner being led through muddy streets. The psychological impact was devastating to rebel morale. If Leicester, one of the richest, most powerful men in England, could be captured and humiliated, then no rebel was safe. The invincibility of noble bloodlines, the protection supposedly granted by wealth and lineage, had been proven illusory. The confiscation of Leicester's estates represented financial destruction on a scale that shocked even his enemies. His English holdings included vast territories in the Midlands, valued at perhaps 700 to 900 marks annual income, roughly 3 to 4% of the entire kingdom's revenue coming from one family's estates. His Norman lands were similarly extensive, The total value of confiscated property exceeded 15,000 marks, more than Leicester had spent on his failed invasion. The crown seized castles, manors, livestock, stored grain, forests, mills, everything. The Leicester family went from one of England's premier dynasties to financial ruin in a matter of weeks. Think about that as a deterrent. You don't just risk death or imprisonment when you rebel. You risk the permanent destruction of your family's accumulated wealth across generations. But here's where the propaganda impact becomes genuinely fascinating. The story of Fornham morphed in popular retellings from a military victory into a quasi-religious narrative of divine judgment. Preachers across England began using Fornham in sermons as an example of God's protection of rightful authority. The foreign mercenaries, already despised as godless hirelings who fought only for silver, became demonic invaders in popular imagination, with the marsh portrayed almost as divine intervention, the earth itself swallowing those who dared invade Christian England. The actual tactics and terrain that won the battle were forgotten. What remained was the story. Foreign invaders came, God opened the earth, and England was saved. This propaganda had real strategic consequences. For the next 2 decades, English kings would face significant popular resistance to hiring large numbers of foreign mercenaries. The memory of Flemings drowning in Suffolk marshes became a cultural touchstone, a warning about the dangers of relying on foreigners to fight English battles. It would take Henry II's son, Richard the Lionheart, to finally rehabilitate the use of professional mercenaries in English military thinking, and even then he faced criticism rooted in Fornham's legacy. By November 1173, less than a month after the battle, the rebellion in England was effectively over. Scattered holdouts remained, but they were isolated, undersupplied, and facing inevitable defeat. De Lucy and de Bohun had saved Henry's kingdom with 400 knights and perfect execution. But while England had been secured, the war wasn't over. Henry still faced his rebellious sons in France, and the outcome of that struggle would determine whether Fornham's victory was temporary or permanent. The fate of the Angevin Empire still hung in the balance, and the lessons learned in a Suffolk marsh were about to be tested on a much larger stage. Here's the remarkable thing about Fornham. Henry II never set foot on the battlefield. He was hundreds of miles away in Normandy, fighting his rebellious sons and the King of France, completely unaware that his kingdom in England had just been saved by 2 aging administrators and 400 loyal knights. When news finally reached him weeks later, it must have been an immense relief. The rebellion in England, which could have forced him to abandon his continental campaigns and return to deal with a 2-front war, had been crushed before it could truly begin. Fornham proved the strength of Henry's governmental system. Even in his absence, even with the kingdom under attack from multiple directions, his machinery of royal justice and military command had functioned with lethal efficiency. This wasn't just about 2 commanders getting lucky. It was about a system that worked. De Lucy and de Bohun had access to intelligence networks, loyal garrisons, supply depots, and a command structure that allowed them to make rapid decisions and execute them immediately. Leicester, for all his money and mercenaries, was fighting not just an army, but an entire state apparatus designed to defend itself. The messenger carrying news of Fornham's victory reached Henry at Rouen in early November 1173, roughly 2 to 3 weeks after the battle. Think about what that communication lag meant strategically. For nearly 3 weeks, Henry had been fighting in Normandy with no idea whether England still existed as a unified kingdom under his control or had descended into civil war chaos. He'd been receiving increasingly alarming reports throughout September and October. Leicester had landed with mercenaries. Rebel barons were mobilizing. Scotland was raiding the north. Then suddenly, one message changed everything. Leicester destroyed, mercenaries annihilated, rebellion in England collapsing. The relief must have been overwhelming. Here's what made Henry's administrative system revolutionary for its time. Most medieval kingdoms were intensely personal. They functioned only when the king was physically present to make decisions, enforce authority, and lead armies. If a 12th century king left his kingdom for extended periods, the government typically fell apart as barons pursued their own interests without royal oversight. Henry had built something different, a bureaucratic machine that could function autonomously. He'd created permanent offices, justiciar, chancellor, exchequer, staffed by professional administrators who had the authority to act in the king's name without needing constant royal approval. This was modern statecraft emerging from feudal chaos. The numbers reveal the scale of this administrative achievement. Henry's government in England employed roughly 150 to 200 full-time royal officials, sheriffs, justices, clerks, bailiffs, who formed a permanent bureaucracy that existed independently of the king's physical presence. Compare that to France, where Louis VII's government consisted of perhaps 30 to 40 officials who traveled with the king and had minimal authority when he wasn't present. Henry had essentially created England's first civil service, and Fornham proved it worked. De Lucy and de Bohun didn't need to ask Henry's permission to mobilize forces, didn't need to wait for royal authorization to engage Leicester. They had standing authority to defend the kingdom by any means necessary, and they'd executed that authority with devastating effectiveness. But here's where it gets strategically brilliant. Henry's system wasn't just administrative, it was financial and logistical. The royal treasury in London held enough silver reserves to fund emergency military operations without needing to collect special taxes first. The garrison system meant trained troops were already positioned at strategic locations across England, ready to mobilize within days. The sheriff network provided real-time intelligence about threats, and the justiciar had the legal authority to confiscate rebel estates immediately, denying rebels access to their own resources. Leicester had been fighting against not just 400 knights, but an entire governmental infrastructure designed to crush internal threats automatically. Think about the strategic implications for Henry's broader war effort. If England had descended into prolonged civil war, Henry would have been forced to abandon Normandy and return to England with his army, leaving his continental territories vulnerable to French conquest. The financial drain of fighting a two-front war would have been unsustainable. England provided roughly 60% of Henry's total revenue. Losing control of England meant losing the war everywhere. Fornham's 4-hour victory saved Henry's entire empire by eliminating one front of the conflict before it could drain resources from the other. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Henry's reaction when he received the news. He immediately promoted de Lucy and de Bohun, granted them additional estates and honors, and most importantly, left them in complete control of England while he continued fighting in France. That decision, to not rush back to England personally after such a crisis, reveals Henry's confidence in his system. He trusted his administrators to consolidate the victory, process the surrenders, and secure the kingdom without royal micromanagement. That level of delegation was virtually unprecedented for a medieval monarch. The victory also had an unexpected psychological impact on Henry's enemies in France. Louis VII and the rebel princes had been counting on the English rebellion to divide Henry's forces and attention. When news reached them that Leicester's expensive invasion had been annihilated in 4 hours, it shattered their strategic calculations. They'd believed Henry's government would be too slow and too weak to respond effectively to a surprise invasion. They'd been catastrophically wrong. The message was clear. Henry's empire couldn't be broken by attacking isolated pieces. The machine was too efficient, too resilient, too deadly. By December 1173, Henry was winning on all fronts. England was secure, Scotland had been pushed back, and his forces in Normandy were gradually containing his son's rebellion. The war would drag on until 1174, but Fornham had been the turning point. The moment when two old bureaucrats proved that government could be more powerful than gold, that systems could defeat armies, and that Henry II had built something genuinely new in medieval Europe, a state that could defend itself even when its king was absent. But the true measure of Fornham's importance wouldn't be clear for years. The battle had demonstrated principles of warfare and governance that would reshape how medieval kingdoms fought and governed. The lessons learned in a Suffolk marsh would echo through English military and political history for generations. The Battle of Fornham stands as one of the forgotten turning points of English medieval history, overshadowed by more famous battles like Hastings or Agincourt. But its importance can't be overstated. If Leicester had succeeded in linking up with the rebel barons, if his Flemish mercenaries had been able to establish a foothold, the revolt of 1173 to 1174 might have torn England apart. The Civil War could have lasted years instead of months, devastating the countryside and potentially ending Henry II's reign. Instead, 4 hours of brutal combat in a Suffolk field and marsh ended the threat before it could metastasize. The battle also reveals something profound about medieval warfare that Hollywood often misses. Battles weren't primarily won by individual heroism or by whoever had more soldiers. They were won by speed, intelligence, logistics, and understanding terrain. De Lucy and de Bohun's victory was a bureaucrat's triumph. They had better information, moved faster, and caught their enemy at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place. Their 400 knights didn't defeat 4,000 mercenaries through superhuman fighting ability. They defeated them through superior planning, aggressive execution, and the tactical gift of fighting on ground they understood, and Leicester didn't. The swamps of Fornham swallowed not just an army, but a rebellion, and in doing so, they ensured that Henry II's empire would survive its greatest crisis intact. Here's the counterfactual that should haunt anyone studying medieval history. What if Leicester had reached Framlingham? If his 4,000 mercenaries had linked up with Hugh Bigot's 800 troops, they would have controlled eastern England from inside one of the kingdom's most formidable fortresses. Other rebel barons, seeing this success, would have declared openly for the rebellion rather than hedging their bets. Scotland's invasion would have intensified, knowing England was divided. The war that actually ended in 1174 might have dragged on until 1176 or 1177, bleeding England white through sustained conflict. Henry might have been forced to partition his empire, granting his sons separate kingdoms to end the fighting. The Angevin Empire, the most powerful political entity in Western Europe, could have fragmented, changing the entire trajectory of English and French history. All of that was prevented by 2 old men, 400 knights, and a swamp in Suffolk. Think about the tactical lessons that Fornham teaches, lessons that remain relevant 8 centuries later. First, intelligence wins wars before fighting begins. De Lucy's knowledge of Leicester's movements, route, and timeline gave him the advantage that numbers couldn't overcome. Second, speed is a weapon. Leicester's 4,000 men were useless because 400 men arrived first and chose the battlefield. Third, terrain is a force multiplier. The marsh at Fornham did more killing than swords did, turning geography into Leicester's executioner. Fourth, morale is fragile. Professional soldiers break just as easily as amateurs when caught in impossible situations. These weren't abstract military theories. These were life-and-death realities proven in blood and mud on October 17th, 1173. But here's what makes Fornham genuinely revolutionary in historical terms. It was a victory of system over chaos, of organization over feudal individualism. Medieval warfare was supposed to be about noble warriors fighting for honor and glory, about personal combat and chivalric values. Fornham proved that narrative was a lie. The battle was won by administrators who understood logistics, by a governmental machine that functioned without the king present, by intelligence networks and rapid communication. It was bureaucracy at its most lethal. De Lucy and de Bohun weren't romantic heroes. They were managers who executed a plan with ruthless efficiency. And that efficiency saved a kingdom. The legacy extended beyond military tactics into political philosophy. Fornham demonstrated that centralized royal authority, backed by professional administration, could defeat decentralized feudal power backed by gold and mercenaries. It validated Henry II's entire governmental project. The idea that law, bureaucracy, and institutional authority could be more powerful than noble bloodlines and private armies. Every subsequent English king would build on this foundation. The exchequer, the common law courts, the sheriff system, all the institutions that made England administratively advanced compared to continental kingdoms, were proven viable at Fornham. The battle was a laboratory test of whether modern government could survive medieval warfare. It could. The numbers tell the final story. 400 knights, 40 miles in 30 hours, 4 hours of combat, 3,000 enemy dead, 1 rebellion crushed. 10,000 marks spent by Leicester, 0 returns. 1 kingdom saved by speed, intelligence, and a swamp that became England's unexpected ally. The Earl of Leicester rotted in prison for years, his fortune gone, his name synonymous with failure. Richard de Lucy and Humphrey de Bohun were celebrated, promoted, and remembered as the men who held England together when it should have fallen apart. But perhaps the most important legacy is this. Fornham proved that in war, as in governance, the side that thinks faster, moves faster, and understands the ground they're fighting on will beat the side that simply has more money and more men. It's a lesson that every underdog force in history has learned and relearned, from valley to valley, from swamp to swamp, wherever speed and intelligence have overcome wealth and numbers. The marsh at Fornham is still there today, peaceful farmland where sheep graze and crops grow. No monument marks where 3,000 men drowned in their armor. No plaque explains how 400 knights saved a kingdom. But the legacy remains in every institution of English government that traces its authority back to Henry II's bureaucratic revolution. The swamp kept its secret. But history remembers. Sometimes the greatest battles are won not by the strongest army, but by the smartest commanders fighting on ground they understand against enemies who never saw the trap until it closed around them. That's the lesson of Fornham. That's why 400 defeated 4,000. And that's why England survived.